couple things you'll need before we get started. I'll be selling these, but I'll also put in there where you can get them elsewhere. That way, if you want to buy more bulk or save a little bit of money, you can. But to make it easy, I will sell these through my shop. Just a standard pen. All these holes are going to be covered up, so you don't have to worry about some of my other patterns using like a heat erase pen. Won't need to do any of that. And I have 2 hole punches. You can vary the size a little bit. The bigger one is for punching the holes in the paper so that you can lay it down and then trace onto your sheepskin. And this is a 5/64. You go a little bigger if you want, but if you go too small, then it's going to be hard to trace through that little hole onto your sheepskin. And the other hole punch is a 0.8. It's almost a 1 millimeter, just a little under. You could maybe go 1 mil. I like to use the smallest hole punch I have. That way the holes are real small. A stitching chisel can be used, but that's more of a cut, so it could potentially rip further when you're tightening the stitches. I prefer a really small hole punch. And you're going to need some sheepskin. I get all mine from Weaver. I'll put some links below. But sheepskin, this is a chrome tan sheepskin. Then you're just going to need some scissors, thread, and a couple needles. You're going to want to print your pattern off. There's only 2 pages to tape together. Cut right on the line here. Then we're going to cover the entire pattern with tape. We want this to have some rigidity so that we can punch the holes and use it to just trace right through onto our sheepskin there. If you want, you can put tape across the backside too, especially if it's just standard printer paper. The stuff I'm using here is just a little bit thicker, so I should be good with just that top layer. You can punch all these holes now, or cut stuff out first. And like I said, this is a 5/64. You could go a little bigger. I won't go smaller. You might be able to go 1 smaller. But go through and punch all these holes out. While all the parts are represented in the pattern, all the A parts are the same, so technically you only need to punch and cut 1 A part out. But I included them all in there just in case, especially if you want to lay out all the parts onto your piece of sheepskin to make sure you have enough room for everything. The other reason might be if you want to go back and just save all these so you can make them down the road, it might be good to have every part in your little bag or whatever. So with that said, I only did 1 A part, 1 boxing, the headband cover, and I'll cut 1 B part out. So you really only need 1 B, 1 A, 1 boxing, and the head cover. Save a little time. I almost grabbed my nice scissors. Never use your nice scissors on paper, especially if there's tape on it. Here's my cut whatever scissors. My wife even had these out in the garden, I think, a couple times. Anyhow, cut right on the line. You don't want to be cutting the seam allowance shorter. Be real diligent about cutting right on this line. You can use a utility knife too if you want. If you go inside of that line too much, your seam allowance is going to be too narrow. After you trace it and cut it out, you'll have a little bit more, but it's already tight to begin with. So that's the only thing I'd be real careful about. Any straight lines, I'll cut with a utility knife. Just make sure you're cutting right on the line. So I am going to skip on cutting everything out, and you'll see why you could just use that 1 template over and over again. But I will write down how many I need for future reference. Altogether, you're going to need 4 of these A parts. You're going to need 2 B parts, just 1 of those, and you're going to need 2 boxing. So now I can just get rid of all these extra ones and just keep reusing these. And you will need to cut that slot out as well. And I'll punch a hole on each side. That's about that size, and then just use a knife to go in between the 2 here. There's a couple ways you could trace these patterns onto your sheepskin. You can just put a little weight on them, even just hold them still while you're doing it. What I like to do is cut a couple small sections out of each part so I can just tape it down. And I'll do that for all of these parts. I also like to make sure they're all from roughly the same density. But I'll just tape that down. However, make sure you're not covering up holes. And this tape can be pretty sticky, so you can place it against your jeans or a shirt or something, or even your hand, just to get a little bit of that stickiness gone so it doesn't stick too much to the back of the sheepskin. It could leave a little bit of residue or pull some of that up, leaving a permanent mark. But then that way it doesn't move around on me. You can use a marker, however, that gets a little thick around that outside edge. So if I do use a marker, it'll only be for these inside stitching holes. And I'll just give it a little twist each time I push it into a hole. If you leave this marker in one of those holes too long, it's going to bleed out and make too big of a dot. So I just tap it in real quick. Or just use a pen. I won't tip the pen too far. It could skew the stitch line a little bit. But I almost always will trace with something fine like a pen or a fine tip marker. That's that. As far as cutting this out, nice pair of scissors works great. Those other ones will work fine too. Little snips cut right on the line. Make sure you're keeping the bottom of the scissors here up against underneath that sheepskin. You don't want to just come in like that and start cutting. You're going to cut that sheep fur all up and it'll be weird. So get this underneath there and slide it right against the skin. To try to keep these fuzzies down to a minimum, whenever you cut, just grab the loose stuff off of it. So 4 of these. And cut out 2 of these. A couple of the A parts, you're going to see the back of this, and you'll see as we put it together. One of these will be inside out, so you can see that side, but on the back of it, this is the other side you're going to see. The B parts are actually going to be going inside of this itself, so what I like to do is find parts where, yeah, there's a couple little holes. As long as it feels like it's not too loose or coming apart or anything, I'll cut the B parts from stuff like this that I wouldn't use for other stuff usually. That's basically just the inside here, and that'll be a little extra padding so that they're softer. You could technically skip this B part and put something else in here. The only problem with that is if you're putting like pillow stuffing or something in there, when you go to slide this through, it could grab some of that. I have all the parts ready to be cut out. We already cut the one, and then there's 3 more. So 4 of the A, 2 of the B parts, 2 boxing, and 1 of the headband covers. And this is just a small section of that sheepskin I got. When you buy a sheepskin, they're actually pretty big, and you can get a lot of these out of just one skin. Like I said in the beginning, I believe this is a 0.8. Yep, a 1 millimeter would probably be good too. But you don't want to go too big, because then it'll make it harder to make your knots and stuff. And so with this, instead of trying to pull wool out of the way, I just lay it flat, get that lined right on the hole. And you'll find that wool doesn't really come out of there. Those little holes don't do much at all. So then we'll punch all the holes on all the parts and get ready for the next step here. The other thing you're going to need is a piece of tag board or something thicker. You can put a bunch of tape on a piece of paper or something if it's too thin. But I'm not going to trace the holes on one of these, because what I'll do is just sew it on a machine like this one to speed up the process. All these stitches will be hidden, so it doesn't matter if you're super proficient on a machine or not. But I will also do this by hand to show anybody that's just going to be sewing everything by hand. And basically 2 of these parts, you have 4 of these, but 2 of these we're going to do this to, and you'll see why later on. So after you trace it, just put tape over the front and back just to make it a little more solid. It also gives it a little more resiliency if it gets moist from snow or something. Just go over the front and the back. For this slot here, you can use a 5/32. You can go a little bit bigger. If you go too big, you might have a little bit of slop. You can go a little smaller. I'd rather it be smaller than too big. But I went just a little bit larger for this because then I'll trace it on here and I can go a little smaller at that point. It'll just make it a little easier to line up. And you should have done this prior to cutting these out. And then we'll punch that slot out when we punch all these holes. Just punch a hole on each end of that slot. Slide your scissors in there. I always go through that first hole twice. Just lock those edges together a little bit better. And I'll start down. You can tie that first knot however you want. I'll get to the last hole here. Go through twice again and then I'll knot it off, but I'm going to continue on with this thread across that piece here. If you skip tying this knot, you can just tighten it up, throw a clip on there to hold it. And that seam will go right in between 2 of those stitching holes, and the 2 holes that you went through to stitch that seam together, that side, that hole will be that one, and vice versa. So we'll be treating those 2 holes as 2 separate holes corresponding to that part. You can clip that all the way around, and if this is your first time sewing something like this up, I suggest doing that. It just makes it a little easier having everything lined up. But you see, I went through the hole on that side of this seam and came up that one, and then I'm just going back around to the other side of that seam, and that will be the next hole on that part. And things can get lined up a little bit better if you throw these clips on. So So if you want to clip this, pinch them together, take a look, and you can kind of twist the parts back and forth to get the holes to line up straight across. When I put the clips on, I don't clip way far. I clip right where those stitches are going to be. Try to pull those pretty snug. And if you're using a real silky thread, you can tighten it and just move one of the clips onto the stitching there. But sewing it like this goes pretty quick, pretty easy. We're getting to that last hole right here again. Let's go through that same one. And I'll usually come back through another hole somewhere, I don't know, just to wrap it around one more time before I tie a knot. And we're going to go through it twice to create that knot. And I'll go through again, put a little dab of glue on that knot too. And I actually have enough left over here, so I'll just do the next step. It's going back and forth across this seam, but we're not going to be pulling it tight because we're going to flip this out, and when we're done, you'll see later on is we'll tighten that over a different part to squeeze that side in. But for this, you do want a long enough piece where it will go all the way around it, and then you have a good amount of excess, because that'll give you something to grab and pull tight when we get to that step. So basically just go in and out of each stitch. The only thing to keep track of is leave a good amount of excess on the end, so we're not pulling these tight. And when you go in, don't go all the way through and back and grab a bunch of that wool. Just go through and ride that needle right along that skin side to come out that next hole, so you don't have to deal with grabbing any wool. And again, we're not pulling it tight at all. We're going to leave each end of that loose so we can tie it later on. This part's done. Just do that one more time to make the other ear. One of these, which I already trimmed, and I'll show you how to do that with this one. One will go on the inside here. You can see this one's already trimmed up before something goes over the top of it. And then this one will be trimmed the same, and something rigid will be sewn to the back of it. And that will actually be seen because that other part will wrap around and squeeze right here. So both B parts will need to be trimmed to give it some shape. That one's done. And since the wool won't be seen, it's not crucial to make it look super nice. just get a decent shape. There, that way we won't be fighting so much thickness of wool around the edges there. To do that, you can use a small pair of scissors or a shaver. I prefer the shaver. Just gotta watch how many teeth you're coming in and make sure you don't go too deep. But a little pair of scissors will also work. Just a little bit. Not even to the stitches, maybe a little short of the stitches. Get rid of those extra fuzzies everywhere. And I might even come in and just trim that up a little more. You just want to make sure you leave this center good and fluffy. You can sew the whole thing on a machine, but this step in particular, I like to just throw through a machine real quick because the stitches aren't going to show. You can just go real fast and you're not wasting any time. But with this one, I prefer to put clips all the way around just so I'm not fighting folds from forming and stuff. More so with the machine. Hand sewing, it might be a little bit easier, but I'll just grab a side and go to the direct opposite side. Try to make sure there's the same amount of slack on each side. And you may need to kind of stretch it just a little bit to get the edges to match up. And then I'll go to the direct opposite sides again. But take a look and make sure each side has the same amount of material. And then fill in between. Doing the same thing. Checking to make sure it's got the same amount of slack on each side. And just fill it in. It may slide off the edge a little bit, so just go back to a clip and make sure those edges are matching. I usually hand sew with machine thread. I just get big spools, that way I can use it on my machine or hand sew. But if I'm hand sewing with it, I'll grab a piece of wax, thread wax, and just run it through. I find that it sticks a little bit better, not stick a little bit better, but the main reason I do it is while you're sewing, you'll notice a thread trying to twist up on itself. And if I wax it, it does that way less. And I always go through twice or even 3 times. It makes it hold that knot better so you're not fighting to keep it tight while you finish the knot. You can see it's holding it nice and tight. You want to pull these tight, but not too tight. If you get stuff to bunch up too much, it could throw off the shape a little bit. So now we have a couple options. The part that will go across the headband section. And this one, well, since I had a mistake there, obviously, this one, I'm going to do it so the first side will be out. But I'll also do one where you shave the fur down and you'll do it with the flesh side out. You do have to shave all that off. I usually use this, but I'll go over that in a minute. The process will be exactly the same. It's just this one, the fur will be out, and the other one will have the flesh side out. basically this will be like a baseball stitch, simplified a little bit. Since we won't have two stitches going, it'll just be one. I'll usually start, we're going to ignore those two holes, we'll use those later. I'll usually start a couple stitches first before I slide this in there. So I made a knot, pulled it up through, and you'll notice there's a big space on this side between those first two holes, and this side it's pretty normal. So I'm coming up from the back side to that first hole here, and then I'll come around, but instead of coming through that side, I'll come up from underneath. And then after this stitch, it'll be that same way every time. We're going to go over, but come from underneath. I try to get as much wool out as possible. And then again, across, but from underneath. Because if you go through and stitch everything together and you pull too tight, it's going to be real hard to get that in there. And you can pull it tight. But the last stitch or two can be left loose so you can see the holes underneath. And since I'm on that side, I'll actually just flip it to make it easier on myself. I'm just going across and from underneath. Careful not to miss a hole. I'll just rotate it just to make it easier on myself. Across. You may have to kind of look a little bit. Again, I'll start, but then push the wool out of the way, just so I'm not grabbing a bunch of it. And that's it. You just go back and forth, coming from the underside. You want to pull them snug, but not too tight. You do want this to be able to slide in there, because this can slide in the earmuffs itself to change the size. So you need a little bit of play so that can bunch up. We'll switch over and I'll do the other one. Just do that all the way across this one and I'll tie a knot. But we'll do the other one because the flesh side being out, it's a lot easier to see where the holes are and to see this process. So we'll do that next. Since that's the last hole, I'll just loop around these last two a second time. And tie a knot. Sometimes when you go to tie the knot, it'll loosen a stitch back. So I'll just grab that thread and retighten it. There's that part. With this one, I'm going to shave that wool off of there and we'll see the flesh side across the headband part. You can see that the dots are kind of faint, and what I used was one of these heat erasable pens. The red is already faint to begin with, but you throw this in the dryer or use a hair dryer and all those spots will vanish. I go over that quite a bit in my other sheepskin videos, so I won't dig into that too much. But it's nice not to have pen marks show too much, even though this will be underneath. But before I finish punching all those holes, you can use scissors, or I like to use a shaver. Just be careful not to dig into the flesh part of this. You can see it gets pretty close to the skin. You can leave just a tiny bit on there. I'm going real short. But if you leave too much, this is going to be too tight. But as long as you sew it while it's on the headband itself, you should be fine. So if you want a little bit of padding, just come in and go, like if you're using this, scissors a little easier, but I'll tip this back a little bit so I'm not all the way up against the skin. You can see it'll leave just a little bit. So you have just a little bit of padding. Either way works just fine. Those teeth can get into those holes a little bit. So that's another reason to just wait and punch the holes afterwards. Plus it's easier, you're not fighting that thick wool underneath. And I'll just punch all those holes. Same as before, same size hole punch. It's a 0.8. After you punch the holes, you can throw this piece in your dryer right away or hit it with a hair dryer to get rid of the marks. I'll probably just leave it alone since they're already faint and most of that goes away after I punch the holes anyway. So this will be the same as before, a little bit easier since you can see all the holes. But instead of this side, we're going to start on this side. And you'll look where the big space is in between those two holes, and then this side it's normal. So we're going to start on this side without that big space coming from underneath, the side we're not going to see. And I'll do a couple stitches first before I throw it on here just to make it a little easier so you're not struggling as much. You'll come from the underside with every stitch, same as before. And just go back and forth. From underneath, over the top, and to underneath again. And having a couple stitches helps. And I'll sew this end slid back to here so that it's not on this narrow part. That way it won't get too tight. It'll be able to slide a little bit if you change the size of this. You want to pull it snug, don't wrench on it too tight or it'll have trouble sliding. And now that we can see where the holes are on the outside, this one's a lot easier. When I get to this last stitch, I like to go through those last two holes a couple times just to hold those two edges together before I tie a knot. So we want to match that opening with the opening on the insert here, which is directly opposite of that seam. First, and if you want, you can put a little double stick tape in there or something. First, we're going to put one of these B parts right in there. Creates a little more padding. Then we'll line up that top. And don't worry if it's off. This thing spins in there pretty easily. So I'll go in, and then I'll just make sure that seam is riding just inside that edge. You can usually just feel And then I'll check that seam, and right on the opposite side, make sure it's lined up with that opening. Then I like to get some of this wool out of the way. You just want to make sure you come in underneath that piece we inserted in there. That's that. And you see, you want some of that looseness like I talked before on that narrow part so that it's able to move if you need it to. So now those two little holes that were left on that little tab is where we're going to come in with this. And what I like to do, just to make it easier on myself, is tie this in a knot so it's not sliding back and forth and trying to come out of there. And we'll take each one of these and go through that slot as well. What I like to do is come through these two holes. It really doesn't matter as long as that thread isn't where that internal piece wants to slide. I'll do the same on this side. However, because tying a knot across that gap there can be difficult to hold tight, I'll come back through this side as well. That way we can tie the knot in that small space here. You can grab a needle or a little modeling spoon or something. What you want is to direct that tab so it's underneath. Like that. I'll throw a little bit of glue on this knot too, just to make sure it stays. I do want to point out that the thread is on the outside. Nothing is underneath where that internal part needs to slide. So eventually that would just wear it out. So the last thing to do will be to put this part inside here and tighten the stitch around it. It can be a little snug or tight to get that to really wrap around it well. Again, twice through, because that'll just hold that a little bit better so you're not fighting it. The other knot's kind of sticking out, so we'll tuck that in. And you see, that just closes in around it and covers up all those stitches. You can go back, and I'll probably do this at the end of the video, and kind of trim and clean this wool up a little bit just to make it look a little more nice. But you do want to get this pretty tight. I'll throw a little dab of glue on there and leave just a little bit of that thread so I can just tuck it in there. I usually like to grab a modeling spoon to do this kind of stuff here. Like I said, I'll usually go back and just kind of trim some of this up to make it look just a little nicer. Just go a little bit at a time. If you go overboard, there's not much you can do. Same thing on the other side. What I like to do is hook this on the end of a table. Just open it up, holds it for me. This piece of it, you can put a couple pieces of double stick tape if you want in there. I don't find it necessary. Just want to make sure that's pulled up, and like I said, that seam has to be on the inside of that plastic. You may have to get that tightened up and put your thumb on it to hold it in place. It tries, it's a good amount of tension, so it'll try to loosen up a little bit on you. Even with going through twice or 3 times.